So as I mentioned, on Wednesday of next week, we will note the 150th anniversary of the issuance of General Order 100, the Lieber Code. Our guest this morning to speak on this subject in his book, Professor John Witt, is the Alan H. Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law at Yale Law School. His previous writings include Patriots and Cosmopolitans, Hidden Histories of American Law, and the prize-winning book, The Accidental Republic, Crippled Workingmen, Destitute Widows, and the Remaking of American Law, as well as a number of articles in the American Historical Review, the Columbian Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, and other scholarly journals. He has written for the New York Times, Slate, and the Washington Post. In 2010, he was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship for his project on the laws of war in American history. Professor Witt is a graduate of Yale Law School and Yale College. He holds a PhD in history from Yale. And before returning to Yale for faculty, he was the George Wellwood Murray Professor of Legal History at Columbia University. He served as a law clerk to Judge Pierre Laval on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. The book about which he will speak this morning, Lincoln's Code, was a New York Times notable book for 2012 and was just awarded the prestigious Bancroft Prize by Columbia University. The Bancroft Prize is awarded annually by the trustees of Columbia University. Winners are judged in terms of the scope, significance, depth of research, and richness of interpretation they present in the areas of American history and diplomacy. This award is considered one of the most distinguished academic awards in the field of history. As I hope you noticed on the way in, we do have copies of the book available, and if time permits, I'm sure we're going to be able to get Professor Witt to sign some of them for us. So we're very happy to have him here, and I would ask you now to please join me in welcoming Professor John Witt to Tiffin.
Thank you, Dean Orr, for that really generous welcome. It's really nice to be here. This is a site, as Dean Orr was suggesting, of some really interesting World War moments in the history of the American Civil War. So I'm glad to come to this to Tiffin to talk a little bit about this book. I thought I'd say a couple words about how I got into this as a way of helping to lay the landscape for the story. A little more than 10 years ago, on 9/11, I was a historian of law living in New York City, just about a half mile north of the World Trade Center. My wife and I sat on our stoop watching the trade centers as the second plane hit. We, like so many Americans, experienced real terror and panic in the midst of those really devastating early hours. And in the years after, as a historian of law, I started to think about the way in which the law came out of, arose in, and impacted that situation. And I started to notice a couple different narratives, a couple different stories, a couple different ways of thinking about the laws of war begin to populate our national conversation. I thought I'd say just a word definitionally about what I mean by the laws of war. So the laws of war that I'm interested in pursuing, that I pursued in this book and want to talk to you about today, are the laws of armed conflict that govern states and combatants in international armed conflict and in non-international armed conflicts, with some variations. It's not the law of the American Constitution allocating power as between the President and the Congress to decide how to use force and when. It's instead an amorphous body of customary principles and treaty laws that bind the states of the world when they go to war with one another. That's the laws of war. It's an inner body of international law, not a body of domestic law. And the two stories that I watched emerging about the laws of war in the months and years after 9/11 went a little bit like this. The story number one, which we could say is roughly associated in the last 10 years or so with the center-left of American politics, goes like this. The story is, since the Founding Fathers, the United States has observed and respected the principles of international law. It went by the term of law of nations in 1770s and 80s. But the rules from the law of nations or international law were core to American identity from all the way back to the beginning. That's story number one. The tail end of story number one is until quite recently when some politicians made a wrong turn and turned away from these core values that are core to American identity, core moral principles that govern and constrain American conduct and guide American conduct. That's story number one. Story number two, which I'd associate with the center-right in the last decade or so of American history, held that the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, are only a recent imposition on the good common sense that American statesmen and soldiers exercised since the time of the founding. Only in the last 50, 60 years, maybe even only in the last 30 years, on this different story, have international principles, principally organized from abroad, from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, come to constrain and bind, often in pernicious ways, the strategic wisdom and insight of American leaders. Now, as I watch those two stories start to play out in American conversation, what immediately struck me as someone who's a student of the law, and the history of the law in the United States, is of course these two stories are radically opposed to one another. They can't both be right. They actually have the stories in exactly opposite fashions. One story has long respect followed by recent departure. The other story has long irrelevance followed by sudden and ill-advised attention to rules that might cause us to depart from whatever it is that seems to be in our national interest in the moment. And so I started on this long, now 6, 7, 8 year project of trying to make sense of which of these two stories was right. And the conclusion I've come to is that neither one of them is right. It's even worse than having contradictory stories. It's neither one of these contradictory stories even comes close to capturing the complicated, rich history of 200 plus years of American engagement with the principles and norms that we now call the laws of armed conflict or the laws of war. So the story I want to tell you about today is a story about 200 plus years of engagement by the United States with the law of nations and international law and the terms of the laws of war that come from those bodies of law. These are rules like rules for prisoners of war, setting out the terms and conditions under which prisoners of war can be held. These are rules like rules against torture in interrogation of prisoners of war or others caught up in moments of armed conflict. These are rules about targeting civilians as opposed to legitimate military targets. This is the array of questions that arise in and around the laws of war. And the story that I've come to think characterizes our history, the United States' history, is a story of contested engagement. That is to say, engagement with the rules from the very beginning, from the very outset, but never exactly the kind of faithful adherence or religious observance that some on the center left in the first story that I laid out for you have sometimes tried to suggest. And I think in that long history of contested engagement, we can see a whole bunch of different ways in which the laws of war have figured in American history. They've been a kind of moral guideline, a kind of moral framework for making tough decisions in grave moments of crisis. They've been a tool, almost another weapon of war that have allowed American statesmen and soldiers to accomplish things that would have been extremely difficult to accomplish without the laws of war as an additional tool in moments of armed conflict. The laws of war, it turns out, have been at the heart of some of the most pivotal moments in the moral history of the United States. And they've helped create the laws of war the world around. And so that's a preview of the story that I want to tell over the next half hour or so of your time. And I'm really grateful that you've come to listen to me tell the story. So I thought I'd start with a few examples, going back to the beginning of American history, to show some of the ways in which American statesmen and soldiers have had difficult and complicated engagements with these rules. It turns out that this place I start the story is with George Washington. Where better to start a story about American history than with George Washington. And it turns out that in the 1750s, the very outset of the 7 Years' War, not all that far from this spot, George Washington became one of the most notorious violators of the laws of war. It was contested whether in fact he'd done what it was said that he'd done, but he was notorious the world over for having been engaged in a massacre of French soldiers in the woods of the Ohio Valley in the run-up to what became the 7 Years' War, really our first World War, though it's not usually described as such. Many of us know it today as the French and Indian War from the American perspective. And so from the very outset, the law of the American experience, and the 7 Years' War really begins the process of the American Revolution by creating a new imperial context in the North American landmass. And from the very beginning, the laws of war and questions about violations and compliance with those laws have been present in American history. If we flash forward into the American Revolution, we can see much the same set of controversies, again articulated and run through the moral framework of international law and the laws of war. Washington spends much of his time now anxiously committed to adhering to those rules, if only so as to establish that the United States is a state, that is a state in the international relations sense, that it's entitled to the protections of those rules, and thus, of course, bound by its obligations. We see Washington from 1776 forward announcing in no uncertain terms to his British counterparts that the laws of war are the relevant laws governing, for example, British holding of American prisoners and governing the terms and conditions under which Americans hold British prisoners. So we can see the laws of war in the American Revolution. We don't just see this kind of strong identity with the laws of war and claiming of the laws of war, though we do see that. We also see things like horrific conflicts in the American South in the post-1779 period. In the fall of 1781, just in the weeks leading up to Yorktown, when the United States will win miraculously the battle at Yorktown and essentially decide the course of events in the war. But in those very weeks, we see James Madison in the Continental Congress threatening to disown the laws of war as inapplicable in a conflict that, in his view, has gotten out of control and can no longer be governed by the laws of war. If we flash forward just a couple more years to New York Harbor in 1783, we'll see American statesmen, including Washington, invoking the laws of war now on their own behalf to challenge and protest the British carrying off of slaves in 1783 from New York Harbor, taking off slaves from all across the American eastern seaboard, taking them to British colonies and back to Great Britain itself. And the Americans are challenging that on the grounds that if there's one thing that civilized states don't do in wartime, it seize an enemy's slaves. So we see lots of engagement with the laws of war, even up to the very beginning of the American Republic, and we see no cessation of that in the decades that follow. The War of 1812 produces a vast law of war discourse, law of war conversation around questions like British raiding parties running off again with slaves in Chesapeake and in the deep south along the Gulf Coast. We see angry protests by now President James Madison about the burning of Washington, D.C., of all the public buildings in Washington, D.C. in 1814 by British raiding parties. This is the same episode that will produce the Star-Spangled Banner a couple days later in the attack on Baltimore. So the laws of war have been with American history from the very outset. One of the great places where we see fierce contestation about the laws of war is in conflicts with Native Americans, conflicts with American Indians. And here the story is exceedingly complicated in ways that are endlessly fascinating, or at least to me, and I hope to persuade you that you ought to be endlessly fascinated with them too. The problem here is, as is so often the case, it's unclear at the outset whether the laws of war are the relevant regime. That is to say, are Indian tribes like foreign states, such that the laws of war, which are a body of international law governing states and countries among states, such that the laws of war are relevant at all? Or are the laws of war out the window when conflicts have what we would today call an asymmetrical character, in which it's Indian tribes on the one side and a state, the United States, on the other? Even if the laws of war are properly invoked, one of the great problems in conflicts with American Indians is, what are the rules? What are the rules? When white settlers and U.S. Armed forces encountered Indians, they encountered armed men fighting by rules that looked like no rules at all. They encountered a tradition that included and licensed things like the systematic torture of captured prisoners from an enemy. When Indians, on the other hand, encountered white settlers or American armed forces, they encountered armed men whom they thought seemed to follow no rules at all. Armed men who burned entire villages, who did a variety of things that, according to the Indian codes of war, looked like the abandonment of rules altogether. And so one of the things we see in Native American fighting with Native Americans is we see a collapse, a ruleless, lawless form of conflict that arises out of the inability of either side to recognize the rules of the other. Because each side, it turns out, had rituals and rules governing conflict. And in many ways, it turns out, I think, that the Indian approaches to regulating armed conflict were more effective, if terrifying, to our eyes. Conflicts over the laws of war continued all the way through the antebellum period. The Mexican War in the 1840s sees the need for the creation of a new institution that we hear a lot about today, the military commission. The military commissions in Guantanamo are a product of the Mexican War and a set of crises that commanders like Winfield Scott, the American general in Mexico, encounter when they realize they have no way of regulating either their own soldiers in Mexico or the guerrilla insurgents who arose in the latter stages of the Mexican War on the other side. And the military commission is a product, a controversial product even in its time, of that Mexican War engagement. And then at the very outset of the American Civil War, we see another set of law of war questions. And here again, it's the same question that arose first for the British in the American Revolution, then arose again for American officials in Indian conflicts in the decades thereafter. And it's the question of whether or not the laws of war properly apply or attach at all. The Lincoln administration's position was that this is a mass criminal conspiracy. This isn't a war with all of the legal obligations, privileges, and protections that attach to war. It's instead a mass criminal conspiracy in which a whole series of southern states have purported to leave the United States, but cannot leave the United States. They're not constitutionally permitted to do so. And so Lincoln and his administration insists that there is no war at all. But this produces a real problem. If there is no war at all, then what are the rules that govern this conflict? What are the rules that attach once Fort Sumter has been fired on? And we first see that question get teed up at the end of April of 1861. So just days after Fort Sumter has been fired on. And the question comes in a form that only a lawyer could love. But you'll soon love to. You'll soon love to. Here's the form of the question. Should the Lincoln administration blockade southern ports or close them? What possibly between these two things? This is just wordplay, one wants to think. Closing the ports, blockading the ports, it can't possibly matter which one we do, or so you might think. It turns out to matter, and to matter a lot. And it mattered a lot because the blockade is an invocation of the international law of war. It's a decision to call the conflict, at least for the purposes of the blockade, a war, and a whole series of entailments flow from that. There is a law of blockade in the law of nations and in international law. That law has a set of rules and terms. They're controversial sometimes, there's disagreement, but there's a framework created by the invocation of international law. Now, a port closure is a radically different kind of thing. A port closure is in the terms that I was using with some of your professors at lunch. This is a homeland security question. This is just a criminal law decision to close the ports and make people crossing over into those closed ports subject to American criminal laws. The problem for the Lincoln administration in April of 1961 is not so much how to govern its relationship with the South as it is how to govern its relationship with European states, principally the British, the French to a lesser extent. The British and the French ambassadors in Washington say, if you call this a port closure, you're invoking the domestic laws of the United States, the criminal laws. You can create those laws as you see fit. We have no say in what your domestic criminal law is, which means that you might, for example, subject our citizens to execution for violating your laws in the same way that we might, the British, let's imagine, we might execute your citizens for violating our laws if they would do so in Great Britain. But you have to understand, says the British ambassador to William Henry Seward, the American Secretary of State, and to Lincoln himself. You have to understand, we're under a lot of political pressure. We have textile mills that depend on cotton from the American South. There is pressure in Great Britain for us to intervene and create a mediated settlement to restore the cotton supplies across the Atlantic Ocean. If we get a British seaman or merchant arrested and subject to criminal prosecution and punishment for coming into one of your ports, the pressure on us to intervene is going to be enormous. We can't do the port closure strategy because it's too dangerous. So the British and the French insist that the Lincoln administration instead adopt the international law approach. They call it a blockade. Now, it seems like just wordplay, choice of words, but the difference is critical. And here's why the difference is critical. The international law means, the international law regime means that the British will understand the rules. These are what we might call a set of off-the-rack rules. That is, they come off the rack like clothes in a department store. They're not bespoke or custom tailored to the situation. We know what they are. They come in standard sizes. The prices aren't too great. These are just off-the-rack rules that we understand and we can make sense of if we're the British. Now, what's happened there, and here in the first couple weeks of the Civil War, and Seward and Lincoln go along, they agree, they decide to invoke blockade, they decide to invoke international law. Notwithstanding that their position is that the South is not a state entitled to international law, but a criminal conspiracy properly subject to punishment. So what's going on? Why have they adopted this apparently inconsistent strategy of calling these criminals, also giving them the privileges of a state? And what Lincoln and Seward had stumbled into was the usefulness of international law. It was a way for them to coordinate their relationship with the British and with the French. And they weren't nearly as worried as some sticklers for international law consistency with the apparent inconsistency of calling it an international law war and calling it a criminal conspiracy at the same time. In some ways, we could think of the Lincoln administration as realizing that antebellum observation that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of criminal minds. Now, what I told you so far is the Lincoln administration has observed the strategic usefulness of this regime, not seen it as a regime of imposing a new set of foreign obligations on them, but instead seen it as something that they could use, a tool for advancing the Union war effort, even in the first weeks of the war. The laws of war become more than that across the course of the war for the Lincoln administration. And we can see that principally if we attend to a problem that doesn't arise in the same way anymore today in warfare, but a problem that was endemic to the first 8 decades of American warfare. And that's the problem of being a slave society in the midst of war. European military officers, all through the antebellum period, were quite confident that they'd be able to win any major conflict with the United States because they knew exactly what to do. They could simply stir up the slave plantations in the American South, produce an internal rebellion, and undo the United States altogether with one swift blow to the American South. Slavery was a huge problem for warfare in the first part of the 19th century. Slave societies were essentially societies of suppressed warfare. Political theorists, going back to John Locke, or the international law jurist in the 17th century, the great international law jurist, the founder of modern international law in some sense, a man named Hugo Grotius, a Dutchman. Grotius and Locke described slavery as a suppressed form of warfare. The slave's slave status is justified, in theory, by having been captured somewhere down the generational lines in an armed conflict. This is at a moment when you could execute your prisoners of war. And so you're thought to have had the lesser included power of enslaving your prisoner of war, who after all should be thankful that he hasn't been executed. Now, if you take seriously that model of what slavery is, it's a stand-in for the execution of a prisoner of war. It means that the slave plantation was, in a sense, in a Cold War state. It was a place of suppressed warfare. And military strategists on all sides of the Atlantic understood what might happen when war came to plantations. That's why the British interventions on slave plantations from 1775 onward in armed conflict had been so controversial. In 1775, the last royal governor of Virginia, a man named Lord Dunmore, proclaims all slaves will come to his side free if they take up arms against their former owners. Virginia slaveholders are outraged at this, seeing it as a violation of all that's civilized in armed conflict. And the same story resumes in the War of 1812 with British raiding parties in the Chesapeake. and on the Gulf Coast. Now, American statesmen and soldiers had long taken a fierce position, a firm position on this question. Their view was that slaves are private property and thus not a legitimate target in armed conflict. Armed conflict can only go after legitimate military targets, and slaves, insofar as they're simply private property, are outside the scope of legitimate military attack as private property. There was a second ground, though, for the problem, for opposing meddling with enemy slaves in wartime, and that was the terror of humanitarian atrocities that might follow once war had become servile warfare, in which slaves were seeking to free themselves. And here there was a long tradition, going back into antiquity, of terrible, terrible wars arising precisely when slave status was at stake. What this meant for the Lincoln administration was that by 1862, there are 90 years or so of American commitments to the idea that what a civilized army does in wartime must never include freeing an enemy slave. And what that means is that as the summer wore on in 1862, and as Lincoln began to think about emancipation as a war measure to restore the Union, he ran into this long-standing tradition of American positions on the laws of war. We see in Lincoln, at the end of the summer of 1862, a really extraordinary set of moral deliberations in which Lincoln, a self-taught just war theorist, who draws just war principles from his readings of Shakespeare and from Blackstone, an 18th century jurist, British jurist, probably the most widely read British jurist in the United States. We see Lincoln reading Shakespeare, reading Blackstone, and developing a theory of the laws of war, recapitulating in just a few short moments several hundred years of just war thinking. And we see the evolution of Lincoln's thought going a little bit like this. And we know this because he jots down notes in the summer of 1862, just writing to himself as he was wont to do as he thought through thorny problems. And his first observation was he knew that he was praying to try to figure out what the right answer to the question of emancipation was. He knew that Union soldiers were praying to defend their effort, to invoke God's favor on the Union war project. But Lincoln was sure that rebel soldiers were praying too. Now, in fact, he suggested slyly, but maybe not entirely jokingly, the rebel soldiers might be praying a whole lot more than the Union soldiers. And the problem was that neither side could tell who was in the right. Neither side could be sure, given the fierce commitments on the other side, that their side was the side that God would favor. Now that observation is the foundation of the modern laws of war. The uncertainty that you are definitely in the right, the moral modesty of not being able to be certain. That's why prisoners of war are not criminals. The prisoner of war, if we're sure that the prisoner of war is someone who fought for an unjust side, should be subject to the kinds of criminal prosecutions that we reserve for the unjust use of violence, the unjustified use of violence. But Lincoln, having recapitulated the basic moral structure of the laws of war up through into the middle of the 19th century, makes a further observation. And this is where he moves the laws of war forward and begins the process that puts us where we are today. He says, but I can't just rest on the notion that I can't be absolutely morally certain, the age of miracles now being over, that I'm on the side of righteousness. I can't rest on that because I've already committed 1 million Union soldiers to being in harm's way. I've started a war. I've moved us down the path to a war which has already killed tens of thousands of Union men and tens of thousands of Confederate men as well. It's caused untold suffering and destruction. So I have to act. I don't actually have it within my power to not act. And so in that moment, what Lincoln has done is he's reintroduced the idea of justice and righteousness into the law of war framework. He's integrated a much older tradition, a medieval tradition, of thinking of justice as front and center in the laws of war. But he's integrated it with a persistent sense of the moral modesty that comes with the modern laws of war, the uncertainty that we can be sure that in the end we fight on the side of the angels. So Lincoln has both of those thoughts in mind as he moves into the emancipation moment. And so it's no surprise, no coincidence, that the Emancipation Proclamation is a law of war moment. Lincoln invokes, on behalf of emancipation, a core idea from the laws of war, and that's the idea of military necessity. Military necessity is what warrants the freeing of slaves on Lincoln's account in September of 1862, as he promises on January 1st, 1863, to free the slaves, and thus the South ends the rebellion. And military necessity is a terrible, terrible and righteous idea all at once. Military necessity will, in the 20th century, become the motto of the German military, as it rides roughshod over rules that purport and seek to limit the kinds of destruction that militaries commit in armed conflict. But military necessity will also be the principle that Lincoln will use in emancipation to justify the freeing of 4 million slaves. The idea of military necessity is that military necessity warrants, licenses, permits all those acts in military, all those courses of conduct in armed conflict, which are warranted to rationally advance a just and legitimate military objective. What the military necessity term does is it brings back in that idea of justice, because you cannot know whether your act, your conduct, the course of conduct proposed is permitted or not, except by reference to the legitimacy or justice of the cause for which you fight. So we see there in Lincoln, in the summer and fall of 1862, a bringing back in of justice questions and righteousness questions into a law of war that had tried to set them aside for purposes of creating a set of humanitarian limits on what one could do to the prisoner of war for example. Now, what this means is that April '61, Lincoln and his administration saw the usefulness of the laws of war. They saw the ways in which the laws of war could allow them to coordinate their conduct with the British and with the French. It was a tool, a weapon, an additional weapon in the Union arsenal. But now in '62 and into early '63, we're starting to see the laws of war figure in a different way. Now here's the laws of war functioning like a moral framework, a guide to decision-making in grave moments of moral crisis. And the laws of war have been both of those things through American history. I think, having run through some of the slavery problems, that we're now in a position to make sense of, and make sense of in a new way, a way that really American lawyers, American soldiers, American statesmen haven't been able to make sense of. The text that comes out of the Civil War that Dean Orr was describing at the outset. So in December of 1862, the Lincoln administration, through General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, commissions a code for the laws of war, a set of 157 articles to be published in a pamphlet distributed to officers around across the United States in the field, which will condense the generations and centuries of law of war rules into a single portable pamphlet that can be used by Union officers. The man commissioned to do this, a man named Francis Lieber. He's a professor at Columbia College in 1862. And he takes on, in the winter of '62-63, the project of restating the laws of war. Now, the laws of war, up to this point, were a set of amorphous customary principles. They existed in big books, multi-volume books, usually in French or in Latin, held by libraries far removed from the field of conflict. What Lieber did in the winter of '62-63 was redraft them in a way that they could be used by soldiers in combat, in the moment. The pamphlet he produces is the forerunner to the wallet card that soldiers around the world carry today, American soldiers around the world carry today, and soldiers of many other traditions as well. This is the first moment where the wallet card is being created. One thing to notice here is that this is also the first time you have a literate army, that you could give a wallet card or a pamphlet and expect the pamphlet or the wallet card to make some sense to the men to whom it was reported. I say we're in a position now to make sense of, to understand a little bit what's going on in the construction of this code, because the creation of the Lieber Code is a mystery. Why would it be that in 1862, at the end of 1862, why would it be that the Union would promulgate a set of rules? We usually get laws for armed conflict in the dismayed aftermath of conflict. 1949 is our Geneva Conventions that still govern us today. not a coincidence. That's the dismayed aftermath of World War II. And the Geneva Conventions are a desperate effort to prevent some of the horrors that we came to know all too well in World War II. We don't usually see rules getting created in the middle of a campaign, and even more difficult to understand at the moment in a campaign in which the Union is about to adopt a much more aggressive strategy, not a moment in which the Union is looking to adopt a new set of humanitarian conditions. Now the answer to the puzzle, as we can put the pieces of this puzzle together, the answer that I propose is the Emancipation Proclamation, the moment of the end of slavery. And the reason the Lincoln administration issues this code at that moment is to legitimate this enormously controversial decision to emancipate the slaves in the South. The code itself contains about a dozen provisions that are really, if we properly understand, about slaves and about black soldiers. The South's position is that black soldiers are not soldiers at all, but criminals. In Union uniform, to be sure, but criminals nonetheless, subject to prosecution. Precisely the prosecution that the laws of war are designed to bring an end to. So why does Lincoln commission a law of war code in the end of 1862? It's to legitimate the army of black soldiers. It's to legitimate emancipation. And in so doing, he not only creates the moral pivot for American history, because emancipation really is a moral pivot in the 200 plus years of American history, he also transforms the law. The laws of war we have today, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the customary laws of war that surround it, come out of that moment of the commissioning of a code of rules published as General Orders Number 100 of the Union Army. And I'll say in just a minute how it is that the Lincoln text, drafted by Lieber, published as an order for the Union Army, and approved by Lincoln in April of 1863, how it is that that becomes a global text, a text that controls armies the world over. As Dean Orr suggested in his opening remarks, it's not only the United States that's thinking about the laws of war in 1862, 63, 64. There is a parallel tradition. The Red Cross tradition is just getting started in precisely the same year. We might imagine there's something in the air, something new, that's causing people on both sides of the Atlantic to start thinking about the laws of war. Now I'm tempted to think there's something new called the War Correspondent. Suddenly, and the photographer on the battlefield, both in the Crimea and in the American Civil War, we're starting to get photographs of combat. We're starting to get on-the-ground war correspondence. So literate audiences reading newspapers are now far away from front lines, learning about war. And I think that's one of the things driving new attention to the laws of war. But in Europe, the laws of war quickly hit diplomatic logjam. The Geneva Conventions of 1864, which is the first Geneva Convention treaty, only governs the sick and the wounded on the battlefield, which is to say, only governs those actors in armed conflict who are no longer capable of being strategic players in the rivalries among European powers. They're essentially outside now of the European rivalries because they've been wounded in such a way as to not make them useful resources for any of the sides in a combat situation. Whenever any new proposal gets made in Europe for the laws of war in the 1870s into the 1880s, it's immediately subject to diplomatic logjam. If the Prussians roll out a proposed rule, the Belgians are sure, they're probably right, that this is the Prussians trying to justify the next occupation of Belgium. If the Tsar proposes a new rule, everyone is sure, and they're probably right, that this is secretly motivated by the Tsar's financial problems. He can't keep up with the European arms race. So all of the proposals that get put out at the end of the 19th century in Europe are immediately subject to this intra-European rivalry problem. So along comes Abraham Lincoln, the Lieber text. There's no way in which the Lieber text has been motivated secretly to advance some intra-European diplomatic project. It's not a product of the Tsar's financial troubles or the Prussians' ambitions or the Belgians' efforts to hold off those ambitions. And so the Lieber text is something that can be articulated, mobilized, and used to become the foundation for a European law of armed conflict. And so in 1899, at The Hague in the Netherlands, we see the first multilateral treaty creating law of war terms to govern European conflicts. And it's modeled on explicitly Lieber's text from 1863. It doesn't hurt that Abraham Lincoln issued this order and won a war at the same time. One of the fears by militarists in Europe is that rules for warfare are secret efforts by pacifists to stop war altogether. It can't be that the Lieber-Lincoln text has that problem, because the Lincoln-Lieber text is adopted at precisely the moment when the Union is becoming more aggressive in its campaign and sees through to a successful end of the American Civil War. That's how the Lincoln-Lieber text becomes the global law of war that we have today. It enters into the Geneva Convention tradition in the first half of the 20th century and produces the rules that we know today. Rules about prisoners of war, rules about torture, rules about legitimate targets and illegitimate targets. The slavery sections in the Lieber Code, I think, have been a source of distraction and confusion for historians trying to make sense of these, of the history of American engagement with the laws of war. How could it be that these rules that no longer seem relevant at all are actually central to the tradition? The story I've tried to tell today that appears in parts of the book is a story that makes those slavery sections front and center to the story. As slavery is front and center to so many different parts of American history, so too is it front and center to the history of our engagement with the moral conundrums of the laws of war. I'm happy to talk at greater length about various contemporary applications. I love the historical story so much that I hope you get some sense of it now. And I think it sheds light in all sorts of interesting ways on the world we live in today. I'll say one last thing, general idea about that application to what we live in today. Remember the stories that I started out with are stories that try to make sense of our current moment. And we often see in law of war circles today concern that the kinds of problems we have today, problems fighting against Al-Qaeda, associated forces, are unprecedented. We suddenly now have new law of war problems. What I leave you with is the idea that actually every generation of American soldiers and statesmen has had its own unprecedented problems in the laws of war. This is not a new phenomenon to our generation. This is a persistent feature in armed conflict. And we should both be disheartened by that. This is not a regime of law that's going to provide easy answers. But I think we can also take some solace in it. That is to say, this framework has been a persistent framework for helping us to try to grapple with some of the most grave decisions in American history. So I'm happy to take questions and talk. Love to hear what your thoughts are.
Thank you very much. I know that some people have to leave quietly to go on to class, but we will take some time for some questions. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand and I'll let Professor Witt manage it. So it's a big narrative story of the history of the Civil War. It just leaves this out. And I think that's been the instinct of historians since the latter part of the 19th century. A kind of skepticism as a result. What we might call an international relations realist skepticism. That is to say, let's get real. These rules don't matter when the rules fall to the wayside and guns start firing. I think that that's a badly mistaken way of thinking about the laws of war. If we expect the laws of war to act like an outside policeman, a beat cop, who can come in and stop things as if from outside the conflict, we'll be sorely disappointed and we'll see no enforcement or precious little enforcement. If instead we think of the laws of war as helping to construct what counts as legitimate, moments when legitimacy counts, then we'll start to see a real bite in this tradition. So a couple examples where you see something like enforcement. At the end of 1861, Lincoln wants to prosecute Southern privateers as pirates. So a privateer is a private ship vessel owner who's been commissioned by a state, by a nation state, to go to war against that nation state's enemy. Now the Lincoln administration's position, notwithstanding the blockade, is still that the South is not an independent nation state. So Lincoln concludes, as does Seward, that the South can't have privateers. So that anybody who attacks Union shipping, a merchant vessel or naval vessel, claiming to be a Southern privateer, is just a pirate on the high seas. And we know what we do with pirates. We prosecute them and we execute them. They're subject to federal court prosecution. So at the end of 1861, there's a series of piracy prosecutions in Philadelphia and in New York.
But what the administration runs into, notwithstanding they hire the best trial lawyers in the country to run these trials, they can't get convictions in New York. Juries acquit. And the juries acquit because the defense lawyers are able to make hay out of the blockade decision that the Lincoln administration made in April. They say, if it's a blockade, then it's a state, then we're in war, and then you can be a privateer. How could it be otherwise, they say? This is what I recalled earlier, a kind of foolish consistency, you'll recall. But actually, there's something to the logic, and juries wouldn't allow the Lincoln administration to just have it both ways. So there's an example. I would call this an example of enforcement. It's an example of enforcement because having invoked the law of war framework has turned out to have real consequences and entailments. You can't just have it both ways costlessly. We can think of the inability to prosecute Jefferson Davis at the end of the war as another analogous example. It's not that Jefferson Davis isn't indicted for treason. Oh, he is. He's indicted twice for treason. But the administration can never, now the Johnson administration, can never bring the prosecutions together. And the reason is there's just too much opposition to the idea of treating this conflict as a war for 4 years and then converting it to a different conflict. So there's the example of the kind of enforcement that I'd expect to see. There are lots of other interesting examples too. I mean, there's union retaliation against retaliation orders against the Confederacy for the execution of black soldiers, because the Confederacy does carry forward the project of re-enslaving or enslaving or executing black soldiers, and we see real enforcement by the real efforts at enforcement. So there are many more examples, but those are two of the ways, the characteristic ways that I'd expect to see the laws of war function in these kinds of situations. I have another enforcement candidate, another example, which would be the military commission. So I told you in my principal talk that Mexican War sees the invention of this military commission as a creature, as a thing. The Civil War sees its elaboration, I won't say perfection, but its elaboration and formalization. We've long known that there are about 4,000, anywhere between 3,500 and 4,500 military commissions during the course of the Civil War. The new thing that I was able to find, it wasn't easy, is that about 1,000 of those are for violating the laws of war. And many military commissions are for martial law violations in places like Missouri, where essentially law and order has broken down. Places that are occupied by Union armies. But the law of war military commission, this is a form of military commission that's been licensed by the Lieber text. The laws of war are being enforced by military commissions. They're convicting usually Southern sympathizers or Confederate soldiers for violating the rules that Lieber has laid out in this pamphlet. There are prosecutions of Union soldiers. They're just court-martials usually. Courts-martial, no need to do them through military commission. So there's another nice example of enforcement in the classic sense. We also see, in interesting ways, the invention of the idea of the war crime in those military commissions. There's a lot of really interesting modernizing work happening. One reason why I think historians have been skeptical, especially today, is we expect to see Sherman to the sea consulting his field manual on the laws of war. And if we don't see that, and we don't, then we imagine these rules must be a sham. If the beginning of modern total warfare can happen, March to the Sea, fall of '64, at the very same time that rules are being promulgated, then surely these rules are sheer hypocrisy or nonsense. They're a sideshow. McPherson should leave them out. I'm not so sure, for some of the reasons I've already expressed, but also Sherman's March to the Sea, we misunderstand this text that Lincoln approves, that Lieber writes, and that Halleck commissions. We misunderstand it if we expect to see it trying to stop Sherman from going to the sea. It's adopted at the moment when the Union is taking off the gloves, abandoning the Rosewater strategy of the war's first 2 years. And it's a code of rules that embraces a fierce form of warfare and legitimates what is, in some sense, a massive act of violence against private property, enemy private property, which is to say the Emancipation Proclamation. So we only by importing into the Civil War a set of 21st century standards about what the laws of war are, do we think the laws of war can't be relevant to Sherman's March to the Sea. It is, in a terrible and righteous way, an embodiment of the law of war in the American Civil War. So we see it enforced or embodied in all sorts of interesting ways, just not the way you might expect. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
I'm curious about this conversation on the Confederate side, and how did they use the laws of war or embrace them in order to legitimize their nationhood, or how did that conversation go?
The Confederate leadership adopts almost exactly the same position that Washington had adopted beginning in 1775 on the law of war question. Their view is that they are an independent state, therefore they're entitled to the privileges and obligations of the laws of war, and they're going to insist on the Union treating them as a state with those privileges and obligations. One of the puzzles that I had at the outset of this project is, why do you see, this is the version of the puzzle I've already presented to you, why is it the Confederacy that issues these rules? I mean, after all, they've got the manpower problem, they have the industrial might problem. I would expect to see the weaker party, if I were a realist in international relations, I expect to see the weaker party promulgating rules for warfare. You see this among neoconservative critics of the laws of war today. They'll use a term called they use a term that goes by the term lawfare. So lawfare is the way in which the powerless parties in asymmetric warfare will invoke rules in which their invocation of the rules is a continuation of the conflict itself. They don't have as many weapons, so they use rules too. But here we see the opposite. We see the stronger party invoking the rules. It was a real puzzle to me at the outset until the slavery story helped me make sense of this. The Confederacy has a very traditional view, according to long-standing American principles at that point, of the relationship between slavery and the laws of war. They don't need to innovate. That is, they get to say, we say what Washington said. It's the Union side that has to innovate, and that finds itself dangerously close to revising the rules in ways it's not clear that it has legitimate authority to do. So we see the innovation coming because innovation is required for the Union and not the Confederacy. There isn't anything like the Judge Advocate Corps in the Confederacy. We see in the Civil War the construction of the modern Judge Advocate's General's Office. One of the staffers is Francis Lieber's son, so there are lots of connections between Lieber and the emergence of a professionalized Judge Advocate Corps. And many of its members, this Judge Advocate group, are leading lights. The sons of the most prominent men in the North, many graduates of Harvard Law School, Columbia Law School, are there as judge advocates at the very outset. So it's a group of really prominent, considered the best and brightest of the American legal profession, find themselves as judge advocates in the Civil War.
Could you talk for just a minute about Francis Lieber?
Yeah.
One of the issues that you mentioned in your talk is this concern that the laws of war were propaganda of the pacifists. And yet Francis Lieber was not a pacifist. So could you talk for just a minute about him?
This is great. There's so much good stuff to talk about here that I leave things out. So I'm glad the dean brings this up. Lieber is a totally fascinating character. He is a Prussian immigrant to the United States. He's born in 1798 in Berlin. And the searing formative moment for him is when, as an 8-year-old, he watches Napoleon march through a conquered Berlin. And he spends, as so many other Prussians of his generation will spend their lives, he spends his life trying to foster a kind of fierce civilization that will be able to hold off the nightmare of Napoleon. So he hopes for a stronger Prussia that will be able to resist future Napoleons. When he comes to the United States, he does the same for the United States that he comes to love. He even gets to fight against Napoleon in 1815 at Waterloo. He's injured, critically wounded, shot through the neck while chasing Napoleon back to Paris in the days after Waterloo. And then when he comes to the United States in the 1820s, arriving in 1827, he fast becomes one of the most garrulous public intellectuals in antebellum America. He can't find a job, though, notwithstanding his garrulousness, or maybe because of his garrulousness, and ends up in a place that he didn't want to go. He ends up in South Carolina. And so for 2 decades, he's a professor at the College of South Carolina, now at the University of South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina. And for Lieber, from Berlin, he's thinking, not even Charleston. I don't even get to be in Charleston, I'm in Columbia. and understands himself to be in a backwater from which he tries to escape for the next 2 decades, only finally in 1857 getting to move to Columbia University in New York. But what this means is, by the time he gets to the Civil War, his children are split. So his oldest son has become an adult in Columbia, South Carolina, and sides with and fights for the Confederacy during the Civil War. His younger 2 sons come with him to New York and side with the Union and fight for the Union. There are moments in the Peninsula Campaign in the spring of '62 where Lieber is pretty sure that his sons are fighting against one another. And his older son fighting the Confederacy will be killed in the Peninsula Campaign in May of '62. His youngest son, his middle son, will lose an arm at Fort Donelson in February of '62 fighting for the Union. So Lieber is someone who has a fierce view of warfare that comes out of his experience with Napoleon. He subscribes to and is one of the only American readers of the views of Karl von Clausewitz, who also comes out of this experience of watching Napoleon march through Berlin and develops a whole theory of warfare, one that's oftentimes described as the theory that anticipates 20th century total war. Lieber is reading and finding much to like in Clausewitz from the 1830s onward. So we see both a fierce Lieber, and we also see a Lieber who understands what it is to have humanitarian states on both sides of the conflict. And the text that he produces somehow manages to capture both of those sides in ways that are extraordinary, both daunting and dismaying and inspiring. Yeah.
Will theoretical rules be applicable to technological advances in war, like biology and other type things that can come out?
Yeah, so the problem of technological advances is a huge problem for all sorts of different kinds of law, but especially so for the laws of war for a couple of different reasons. One reason is, we could never have a Lieber code produced today. The Defense Department actually just ended a 2-decade-long project of trying to create such a thing, and it has collapsed and failed. One of the reasons is that Lieber gets the benefit of being able to act on essentially a blank slate. He also gets the benefit of being able to act unilaterally in a world in which there isn't a massive executive branch in which lots of different departments and agencies want to have a say. He writes the thing for the General-in-Chief, who shows it to the Secretary of War, Stanton, who shows it to Lincoln, and the thing's out. Could never happen today. What this means is that now changing or updating the laws of war is an extraordinarily complicated process now, one that would require convening multilateral treaty bodies and the like. And with technological changes, this is especially problematic. It means that the laws of war have become a project of interpretation rather than a project of new norm promulgation. It's one of the reasons why lawyers, I think it's one theory I have, about why lawyers are playing such a prominent role in national security crises these days, is that we're now in a domain of interpretation rather than updating with the creation of new rules. But the technology problem, Lieber had an interesting view of technology stuff, because there were technological advances that came up during the course of the Civil War, things like landmines. And Lieber's view was always, the question you have to ask is whether the course of conduct in question, using something is justified by reference to the military project at hand. This is the military necessity test, and he insisted on asking it over and over again. What he concluded from that is that it's very difficult to say that any one particular weapon system, he didn't use the language of weapon system. I shouldn't even use the language of weapon system. I barely know what that is, but let's imagine this is a weapon system. Any new weapon system can't be evaluated simply on a yes or no in the abstract kind of sense. You always have to ask the question contextually. In this situation, is it permissible? Now, what's striking about that is in adopting that view, Lieber essentially anticipates the International Court of Justice's 1990s decision about the permissibility of nuclear weapons. As we do have international adjudicatory bodies who've been asked to answer the question, is it permissible ever to use a nuclear weapon, which once upon a time was the new technological thing? And the ICJ says we can't say in the abstract. With a new technology, the question is always going to be contextual. It was an enormously controversial decision. It continues to be a controversial decision because there are many who'd like to have some kind of a hard and fast line, a marker. Say, no, you can't use them. Even if maybe they're going to use anything, it's useful to have that rule. But the ICJ said, no, Lieber's way of thinking about it was correct.
Thank you very much. A small token of our thanks in here, a coffee cup and a challenge coin, but
Excellent.
another gift. We do have a little bit of time before we have to bring Professor Witt back up to Detroit. Our bookstore has got copies of the book outside if you've not yet picked up a copy, and he's graciously agreed to sit out there and talk in an informal basis and sign some copies for at least the next 18 or 20 minutes. So, thank you very much again.
Thank you.